I've spent the past year or so silently rewatching G-Next in preparation for this video, and it turned out it was just what I needed. It's a series about change, a series about growth, a series about progress, a series about how time changes everything. And then immediately the franchise it belongs to gets obsessed with being stuck in the past and trying to relive the old glory days. And now we're hitting the point where it's come full circle, and they're trying to pander to G, the series they presumably rushed and cut short in favor of nostalgia pandering. I love Cardfight Vanguard, but this just tires me to see. I want a new series. I want them to keep growing. I want them to actually pay attention to their own moral that they spent so long trying to teach. I'm still a lifelong Vanguard fan, but nowadays I find it impossible to care about the anime. Maybe the Emmy arc will be good. I don't know. I'm vaguely interested, but I'm not excited. Running a Vanguard YouTube channel has left me overthinking everything, trying my absolute hardest to justify every single opinion I have, and then when I post that opinion online, I'll be called out on it and told I'm too negative. Like, is that what this has come to? Me posting week in and week out about why I hate this franchise, despite the fact that it means the world to me? The Cardfight Vanguard anime and I have been going through a rough patch right now. But that's okay. I'm sure we'll get through it. I'll come running back whenever it is they decide to do something creative and new, however long that takes. Will it ever happen? Yeah, definitely. I know it will, and I can't wait for it. Cardfight Vanguard overdress was officially announced in January 2021, and when it was, I had a lot of negative things to say about it. Both the card game and anime were received with a lot of excitement, while I was worried about so much change. I think I'd been burned so many times in the past by the reboot that I was reluctant to give overdress the benefit of the doubt it deserved. I thought the best way of winning back fans like me was to do a series where we played things safe again, not realizing it was this mindset that led to the reboot in the first place. After being given a few days to reflect on this, I felt a lot more positive about the changes made to the card game, but was still worried about the anime. I wanted more than anything for it to be good. I kind of needed it, in fact. There had been so many seasons I disliked in a row that at some point I'd have to give up, right? Then the first episode aired, and I instantly became a fan. I now really enjoy Cardfight Vanguard overdress, and this video will be talking about why. Oh, and I'll specifically be focusing on the first 12 episodes of the overdress anime, okay? Cool. The first episode of Cardfight Vanguard overdress is incredible at playing with expectations to build up to an exciting ending. It begins very unexpectedly and slowly. At first it doesn't even feel like the first episode of a series in how casual of a tone it has. It's just the main characters hanging out and being introduced to Yuyu slowly as the episode progresses. We spend a large amount of time dealing with a comedy relief character who's obsessed with dragging Yuyu to karaoke with him. By intentionally withholding all the things you'd expect from a Cardfight Vanguard episode, it builds up this anticipation. I was eagerly waiting for when we get to see the card game and how it would be presented, and when we do finally get there, it ends up being far flashier than it's ever been before. But whilst this episode feels like a huge change from everything we know about Vanguard, when you stop to think about it, it really isn't. We start off using a slice of life tone to introduce our main characters. The protagonist is pulled out of his comfort zone, a character the protagonist looks up to introduces him to Vanguard, and we get to see a card fight that causes the protagonist to finally feel like they have somewhere they belong. Now of course, you've probably guessed, I'm describing both the beginning of the 2011 anime and overdress. They have that much in common. This is a technique we see a lot throughout overdress, and that's taking ideas we've already seen before, but presenting them in a completely different way. This series is still the same old slice of life card game series we know and love. Almost everything in overdress has some kind of reference or relation to the series that came before it. All at the same time, it feels new and dangerous, but also comfortingly familiar. This is what makes it so good. The process of staying true to the elements that made the series so distinct and lovable, but brought to a new generation. As a franchise that's gone on for a decade now, the key to longevity is to find ways to appealing to new fans and making sure the barrier for entry is as low as possible. For many, that's the 2011 anime. For me, that's G-Next. And for the new fans, including my younger sister, it's Cardfight Vanguard overdress. No way is overdress's technique of presenting old ideas in new and exciting ways more apparent than the way it handles the card fights. This direction has been the source of a lot of strong opinions that are all over the place, so that's why I'm here to say that I'm right, you're wrong, and you should all agree with me. I'm joking, of course. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, and in fact I don't want everyone to. Preferences exist, and I completely see where pretty much everyone is coming from. Really, I mean it. ovDress's new style of doing things is so different and radical that of course it's going to have lots of different opinions surrounding it. But that's my point exactly. Let me posture this. In my opinion, it's better to try something new and fail than to stay in your comfort zone. Time to stop beating around the bush. I'm talking about the reboot again. Knock that one off your bingo card. It's not a coincidence that I'm releasing this ovDress video while it's still so new and relevant, but still can't bring myself to rewatch the reboot to make the video about that. Even if the reboot was well made, it'd still just be the old anime again. There's almost no new ideas or twists here. Let's, for the sake of argument, pretend the reboot is still objectively, oh god I hate that word, better than ovDress. I'd still prefer ovDress anyway because its changes are exciting. Even if you don't agree with me, I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. So, what are these big changes I've been hyping up so much? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the actual premise is pretty much the same. We still have the characters standing at a table playing the game in a more realistic manner than we're used to for a card game anime. And we occasionally cut to the units fighting on planet Crate to better visualize the fight via the explanation of it being what the characters are imagining as they play. The part that's different isn't what they're presenting, but how they're presenting it. The elephant in the room is of course the jaw-dropping animation during the scenes that feature the Crate units. But to pretend that's the sole good aspect would be doing everything else a disservice. To me, one of the biggest changes is the use of lighting. Card fights now exclusively take place at nighttime with harsh spotlights directed at the characters. This not only looks gorgeous, but it adds a lot to an important part of Vanguard, the imagination. Other card game anime will use things like holograms or virtual reality to show the units fighting each other, but Vanguard, the good parts anyway, use the characters imagining the battle in their head as they play. ovDress steps this up a lot by evolving it to roleplay. Look, you've got to be a nerd to some extent to play a trading card game as a teenager or adult, and the kinds of nerds who play card games also usually love the idea of role-playing. The characters in ovDress will intentionally exaggerate the way they act in order to have more fun playing. From Megumi's battle uniform, to the way Toyo is introduced as some mysterious challenger with a hidden past. This stuff is insanely fun and makes the cast of characters instantly endearing. This brings me back to my point about the lighting. The void of darkness broken by bright spotlights is shorthand for theatre, further conveying that each character themselves is playing into the bit. This creates for so many more dynamic and varied ways of showing the imagination aspect. In Vanguard 2011, the imagination was shown by directly cutting to units standing opposite to each other and occasionally taking turns performing very basic attacks. These units would sometimes have the character's face switched out on them to represent themselves imagining them as the unit, but that was the extent of it. ovDress, on the other hand, uses the freedom of the dark backdrop and character role-playing to do so much more. Danji shoots Toyo. Galmage held staff drops onto the fight table. Toyo holds Alden's sword. ovDress doesn't show what a card fight looks like, but instead it recreates what a card fight feels like, and there's a huge difference. The reality is constantly blurred, leaving the viewer questioning what's really happening and what's just imagination. One moment the characters are placing cards on a table, the next, the table has disappeared completely and Danji runs forward as the camera zooms into Toyo's eye, revealing the most exciting action scene in card game anime history. There's no other word for it than unbeatable, but what makes it even better is how it's paced. The fight in episode 1 began with the most fateful recreation yet of what a card fight looks like in real life. The cards are sleeved and the characters don't loudly shout out the name of each card they use. It's the build-up of how we get to the action at the end that makes it so satisfying. The card fights in ovDress are some of the shortest in the franchise so far, but they use the short length to their advantage. Just like pretty much everyone else, I went into ovDress with the opinion that the older seasons had really good long card fights. But I've recently went back to rewatch the 2011 anime and have come to the realization those card fights were not good because they were long, but instead they were good despite the length. The old card fights tend to take up one full episode, with some important ones being 2 or even 3. I remembered liking this because it gave us more than enough time to show the fight in full detail, but that's the problem, it's more than enough time. The multi-episode card fights especially, which were the most important ones, suffered from the overbearing length. See, the parts from the card fights I did remember were still good, but what I had forgotten was how much padding they had. Aichi would tend to take one turn, and during that we'd have him explain his strategy in detail step by step. Then we'd cut to another character, usually Miwa, who would reiterate the strategy in even simpler terms, even though we were already following along. Then we'd have Aichi's inner monologue remind us of how important this fight was to him and why he needs to win, followed by flashbacks to the events that led up to this point, which we'd already seen a few minutes ago. To put it simply, these fights are like at least 50% padding, and it's a shame because they're really good. I'll never forget moments like Misaki revealing she'd successfully stacked her deck in such a way that she'd memorized the position of every single remaining card. Moments like that are incredible. It's just a shame they usually take a full episode's worth of runtime to get there. Years later I'd forgotten this slow padding and only remembered the exceptional parts, giving me a warped and inaccurate memory of what the series was like. ovDress's card fights have about as much worthwhile content in them as the 2011 anime does, but instead of stretching them out over multiple episodes, they instead do the opposite and condense them down in such a way that makes every moment important. The downside is that yes, this makes the fights more difficult for newcomers to follow along with, but put a pin in that because we'll come back to it later. Whereas the upsides are countless. By having the fight go by this quickly, it rewards the viewer for paying attention and putting the pieces together themselves. Instead of having Danji loudly explain his strategy, we see Toyo growing increasingly frustrated that Danji won't guard any of his attacks. Toyo makes fun of Danji for this, accusing him of barely even playing the game by being so passive. But then Danji enters Final Rush and starts using up the cards he was saving in his hand, turning the tables of the fight very quickly. It's at this point Danji utters the line, "Are we having fun yet?" as a reply to Toyo's earlier taunt. If you're familiar with the game, you'll piece together why Danji has done this. Having his opponent point it out is enough to get you to pay attention to it. You don't need this strategy condescendingly explained in depth. Show Don't Tell is the most basic tool of storytelling, and not only does it make the fight more satisfying to follow along with and piece together yourself, but it also ends up telling you a lot more about the characters. Toyo getting frustrated by Danji not guarding shows us that Toyo takes the game very seriously and is easy to get insecure, while Danji toying with him back shows how free-spirited and in the zone he's feeling. That's exactly what I mean about ovDress's fights being dense. They have the same amount, if not more, great content in them as the 2011 fights, but condensed down instead of stretched out. Every moment is important. Granted, this approach does make the fights nigh impossible for newcomers to follow along with, but that's intentional. It sounds like a contradiction at first, right? That ovDress is supposed to be a series that marks a new entry point for fans, yet doesn't attempt to teach those fans how to play. But that's another genius move. First of all, you don't need to be able to follow along with the card game itself to enjoy the anime. In the example I gave, I talked about how Danji and Toyo reacted to each other during the game, and that's something you don't need to know how to play to follow. You know why these characters are fighting, who's winning, and why it's important from the character interactions and flashy animation alone. You do not need to know what Violent Bruce's skill is to know that Danji's winning here. But what if you do want to learn how to play? Well, I'm sorry to break it to you, but the anime was never very good at that anyway. The most important part of learning to play a card game is the part where you actually play a game yourself, and you'll hit with this moment where everything starts to click into place. An anime character can repeat the rules as many times as they want, but if you haven't played it before, it won't click. Now, it made sense for the original Cardfight Vanguard to include a tutorial anyway. The game was brand new back then, so it helped ease people in, and it wasn't exactly a waste of time because he had 65 episodes to burn anyway. But in this new, more character-focused season, yeah, just don't bother, it doesn't help enough to be worth it. The official Vanguard channel made an ovDress era tutorial as a separate video if you still really want it, and the start decks are only $4 each. It's never been easier to learn how to play Vanguard, and the anime using the nice animation to hook new fans in, and the cheap start decks to actually get them to play, is a very smart combination. Basically, there's no excuse for anyone watching the anime and complaining they don't know how to play. If you actually care, you'll go and learn on your own time, which is more rewarding than watching an anime character explain it to you anyway. This video has been very positive so far, and that's because I like ovDress a lot. However, I do think I should point out some of the problems I have with the show before we go any further. Episode 1's plot is brought into motion when Yuyu is forced by his sisters to cross-dress. This causes them to run away from home and meet Team Blackout. All this stuff is really good actually, I don't have any problems with how the cross-dressing is treated, and in fact would argue it's positive representation because Team Blackout accept Yuyu with open arms. There's a scene in episode 2 where Zakuza even encourages Yuyu to not think so negatively about the cross-dressing. No, my problem is that the angle is focused so heavily on in episode 1, only to disappear. See, the first episode of a series is our introduction. It needs to give us a feel for what the series will be about, so it stands to reason anything that gets significant screen time in episode 1 will be really important for one reason or another. The karaoke guy scenes were how we were introduced to Megumi, Tomari, and Danji, so those scenes are important. And you don't need me to tell you why the card fight was so important too. But the cross-dressing gets so much attention and screen time in episode 1, only for us to have a short scene where Zakuza encourages Yuyu in episode 2, and then we see Yuyu choose to wear the outfit again in episode 5 for a visual gag. And that's it. I could be generous and say this does count as a character arc. Yuyu goes from protesting against the cross-dressing in episode 1, to having accepted it in episode 5 and doing it willingly, but the problem is that if this is the case, we should have saw more of that journey. Now of course this is just the first 12 episodes of overdress, there absolutely could be more attention placed on this in future seasons. In fact, I'm pretty generous to most other plot elements and character arcs specifically because of this. The problem with Yuyu's cross-dressing arc is that it's kind of complete. He's already gone from hating it to willingly doing it. I'm not sure how a future season would fix this without an awkward flashback or something. Another problem I have, and admittedly this is going to sound more like a compliment at first, but I want more. And we are getting more, this is just a hiatus, so it shouldn't be a problem. But what I'm actually referring to is that I would have liked to have seen the villain arc that we saw in the last 3 episodes to have happened in a future season instead. I've seen one of the complaints regarding overdress being that it has too much filler, but I disagree in the opposite direction. I think it needed to be slower paced in some areas. I'd like to have seen the Toyo focused episode 6 to be moved to the finale of this season so that season 2 could focus on all the stuff that happens afterwards. And then we could use the extra time granted to have more fun slice of life episodes that gives us more of a feel for each of the characters. Being a slice of life has been a pretty massive aspect of the best Vanguard seasons, so whilst I love the element here, I think we should have got more of it. This isn't something that massively ruins the season, it's just something I would have done a little differently. While other people may have said, finally, plot in the later episodes, I found myself wishing we waited a little longer. But why? Why would I not want plot episodes? Well, it's not that I don't like the plot, far from it. I think the most eventful episodes are by and large the best ones. I just think the reason these plot-focused episodes hit so hard is because we've had time to be introduced to the characters and get attached to them. I like this cast of characters, so seeing them mess around and get into low-stakes adventures only furthers the amount I like them, which is why my favourite characters are ones we've seen the most of, like Danji, Toyo, or Yuyu. I feel like if characters like Zakuza or Tomari got another focused episode each, I'd care about them a lot more. This is a problem that should become irrelevant fairly quickly once we get more episodes, but it was still something worth pointing out. I know, it's very weird to lump 2 things as major as the story and characters together in one category like this, but honestly the 2 are inseparable. This is a series that is very much character focused first with the plot coming second. It's a slice of life season that prioritizes introducing each character with us getting some plot beats spread out here and there. Outside of the card fights, the most prominent complaint I've heard about overdress is its abundance of filler, and as I mentioned earlier, I think the opposite is true. Look, this season is intentionally designed to be a slice of life rather than a tightly written battle shonen. You may not personally like this decision yourself, but to claim that it's some kind of accident or oversight that the series is paced this way is very silly. So if the main priority here is introducing the characters, what do they have going for them? A lot, actually. Some of the characters have far more going on than others, but even the most basic characters end up being fun and entertaining to watch. For example, this background character. I'm not joking, I really mean it. I'm gonna be honest, I thought the designs for the background characters of Blackout were far too good to be used for such inconsequential characters. Usually when a design looks as good as these, it's because the designers, in this case Clamp, poured a lot of time and effort into them. Most other series in general don't put any real time into the background characters because they show up so little, and that makes a lot of sense. But in overdress, the background characters having such nice designs is important. It means you remember them. Remembering them in this way makes Blackout feel like a far more real team. These characters become familiar acquaintances that you don't interact with but you see around very often, like the real life people I see around my local card shop. This adds a lot to make Wonder Hill feel like a comfortable place you'd want to hang out at, and better yet, these characters do occasionally get moments to shine. Back to the character I pointed out a moment ago, her name is Arcane. She's always seen chatting in the background with Mai, who is a character who has my favourite design. Arcane becomes the temporary commentator when Tomari is card fighting, and she comes off as far more shy and reserved than Tomari does, often attempting to get other people to take over for her. This isn't a particularly complex or nuanced character, but she is indeed a character. One who feels real. Her and Mai's designs always stood out so much from the background that it became kind of a game me and some others on Twitter would play, trying to guess whether or not the two of them would appear in the new episodes, leading up to a euphoric moment in episode 11 when Mai finally got a speaking line and a voice actor assigned to her. This tiny moment that honestly doesn't even mean anything felt monumental to me and my Twitter followers. That's how good this series was, we were even invested in the background characters. But of course, onto the actual main characters. We're introduced to Team Blackout from the eyes of our main character, Yuyu Kondo. Yuyu is a fascinating protagonist in that they find ways of setting him up to be a really important main character only to keep undercutting it. He's initially chosen to be Danji's successor, but then that's changed to Tohya in the finale. He tries to stop Toyo from burning the Blackout banner by challenging him to a rematch, but fails, leading Danji to be the one to bail him out. What makes this so interesting is it removes a certain level of plot armor that a protagonist is expected to have, which changes the dynamic of the show as a whole. Yuyu is set up to be a really important character early on, and will undoubtedly get his moment to shine in future seasons, but here he's still a rookie who's in way over his head. Instead of relying on the main character to deal with every conflict, we have to consider the whole cast. Danji ends up being the character who actually serves a lot of the function we would have expected Yuyu to. He's the one who ends up being Toya after all, but Danji clearly has a lot more on his mind than whatever it is that's going on at any given moment. He's been known to disappear when he's needed the most, and is bad at communicating with his teammates, a quality that only causes more confusion and conflict among the group. What I like so much about Danji is that he's very powerful and gives off a very warm and friendly aura, but he's not exactly honest or dependable. When he's around, he's potentially the most engaging character to watch in the entire franchise, yet when he's distracted or missing, it really feels like the entire dynamic of the show has changed. The show no longer feels as warm or comforting with him no longer around. He's my favourite character by a large margin in overdress so far. Megumi is brash, loud, and gets herself into situations that can be easily avoided. A lot of the plotlines that could be wrongly accused of filler are caused by Megumi being so short-sighted and stubborn. This is great because it contrasts so heavily to how she acts when she's at home with her family. Overdress as a series deals a lot with the theme of identity and who your true self really is, and no character demonstrates this better than Megumi in my opinion. There's the version of her that always tries to act quiet and proper in an attempt to impress her brother and fit in. When she joins Blackout though, she's completely different, and this is the real Megumi. Once she's around people she trusts, she no longer worries about covering up her flaws, and her friends accept her for it. Tomari Seto is a character I really would have liked to have seen more of. She's a character who's portrayed as part of the main cast in all the marketing, yet in the series proper she's given the least to do. Granted, she does get a lot of screen time, but most of it spent having her either commentate fights or serve as a comedy relief character. There's a frame in the opening that seems to hint to a deeper story to her, but unfortunately we haven't seen any of that yet. As far as comedy relief goes though, she's certainly one of the funnier characters in Vanguard, with her jokes never being stretched out too long. Finally we have Toyo, who I've mentioned quite a few times in this video. Toyo is the ace up this season's sleeve, constantly shaking up the show with each and every one of his appearances. After his first card fight, he disappears for 5 episodes, leaving everyone to wonder what was up with him. It's not too unusual for a Vanguard series to take a few episodes to introduce each character, but by giving Toyo such a memorable appearance in episode 1 and then not mentioning him again for a while, it left me wondering who he really was. I had a theory that he'd be a rival, constantly pitting himself against Blackout and acting distant, so that whenever a villain does eventually come into play and all hope is lost, Toyo is the one to jump in and save the day, admitting that he was actually fond of Blackout this entire time. What we actually get is a far more complex character than that. Toyo is a gifted kid who grows up pressured by his parents to become a doctor. His grandmother gifts him a Vanguard start deck for his birthday and tells him there's more to life than just studying and work. It's at this point Toyo quickly becomes addicted to the game because it's his only outlet. He was raised by parents who held him to impossible standards, so his inability to accept failure carried over to Vanguard as well. He kept chasing the high that Vanguard gave him, but beat himself up over trying to achieve perfection. Eventually this made Toyo an intimidating person who was deemed not fun to play against anymore by his friends. In the present day, he's a very talented and kind person who tells you that the reason he's determined to beat Danji is he wants one more good win so he can be satisfied and finally quit the game and go back to focusing on work. However, being the medical student he is, he clearly knows that that isn't right. His addiction leaves him constantly thinking just one more game, and he can truly never quit. Eventually, he starts to believe the lie. All of this leads to the moment where Yuyu does beat him and causes something in him to snap. A perfectionist being beaten by a rookie must have felt like an insult to Toyo, who must have felt like he deserved to win more. When he comes back a few episodes later, it's as an antagonist working under Masanori who plans to burn down Wonder Hill and its banner. One other thing I want to mention is how in most other card game anime, the message will be about how taking the game so seriously is bad and fun is the only valid reason to play. But both Yuyu and Danji acknowledge that Toyo taking the game so seriously makes him a more exciting opponent to play against. Even in a moment as high stakes as this, Team Blackout are accepting of who people really are rather than forcing them to pretend to be something they're not. This is what I meant when I said the plot and characters are inseparable. It's the characters' introductions and arcs that naturally lead into the plot and vice versa. These characters, in my opinion at least, are so likable and entertaining to watch that I was hooked. By the time we did get plot-centric episodes later in the season, I was left on the edge of my seat, genuinely caring about these characters. It made the ending of the series very tense and emotional for me. ovDress is, and I assume will continue to be, a heavily character-focused show. As someone who already loves this cast of characters and wants to see more of them, I really like this approach. But I can also see why some other people might be underwhelmed or disappointed by the show as a whole if none of the characters have connected with them. I said all the way back near the beginning of this video that ovDress would keep presenting old ideas in new ways, and that philosophy shines through here too. You really had to care about, or at least be entertained by, the cast of characters in the 2011 anime to like that show. It may sound like a no-brainer, but I genuinely feel like a lot of the discussion around ovDress has forgotten that, or at the very least downplayed it. All this series truly needed was fun card fights and characters I cared about. Those were the two main things I kept openly saying I wanted from a new Cardfight Vanguard series, so regardless of what you think about the show yourself, ovDress delivered both in spades. That's what made me go from being skeptical about the show to being turned into one of its most vocal fans so quickly. The first episode made me fall in love with Danji when he was introduced, and that's not a joke either, I really mean it. I guess that makes me bi, huh? And the Cardfight showcase is one of the best I've ever seen. We're only 12 episodes in, but I already think that this show is something special. I don't think this video will win over anyone who doesn't already like the show, and I know there's a lot of aspects of it that I haven't really covered. I don't need or even want you to agree with me, I just hope I've done a good job of conveying why I like this show. So that's it. That's all I've really got for this one. I think all this editing has earned me at least a few new subscribers, so go do that. Yeah, thanks. See ya.